The most profound connections often begin with the smallest deceptions. In the scorching summer of 1884, two isolated families in Silver Creek, Wyoming territory found themselves entangled in a web of well-intentioned lies that would transform their lives forever. What started as desperate attempts to heal broken hearts would ignite a scandal, spark unexpected romance, and prove that sometimes love requires a gentle push, even if that push comes wrapped in deception. Margaret Hayes stood on the sun-bleached porch of Hayes Inn, her weathered hands clutching a faded apron as she gazed down the dusty trail leading to town. At 42, she carried herself with the rigid composure of a woman who'd learned to bear life's burdens in solitude. 3 agonizing years had crawled by since cholera claimed her husband, Daniel, leaving her with a struggling 2-story inn, 40 acres of stubborn ranch land, and a daughter whose spirit she feared was withering alongside her own. The inn sat 2 miles east of Silver Creek proper, close enough to attract weary travelers bound for the mining camps, yet distant enough that Margaret felt isolation pressing against her chest each dawn. 6 upstairs rooms remained mostly vacant, except during cattle drive season, when cowboys paid 50 cents for a bed and breakfast. The meager income barely covered supplies from Patterson's general store and the property taxes that arrived each November like clockwork. Are you living or merely surviving? Sometimes the difference lies in a single brave decision. "Mother, the stew needs seasoning," called Isabella Hayes from inside. At 20, Isabella possessed her mother's determined jawline and her late father's restless energy. She moved through the inn's kitchen with practiced efficiency, her chestnut hair escaping its practical bun in the August heat. Isabella had adopted her mother's maiden name after her father's death, a small rebellion Margaret had permitted without fully comprehending. The girl claimed it honored her grandmother, but Margaret suspected it was Isabella's way of creating distance from grief's suffocating embrace. "The Hendersons are departing tomorrow," Margaret announced, entering the kitchen. "That leaves only Mr. Clifton, and he mentioned heading north by week's end." Isabella's shoulders tensed as she stirred. They both understood what empty rooms meant. Less income, mounting worry, and endless evenings sitting across from each other with nothing to say except the things they were both too proud to speak aloud. 7 miles across the valley, where Willow Creek carved through grazing land stretching 15 miles to the mountain foothills, Nathan Blackwood stood in his ranch yard, watching the sun sink behind the peaks. At 47, he remained an imposing figure, broad-shouldered, lean-hipped, with a weathered face that revealed nothing and steel-gray eyes that revealed even less. The Blackwood Ranch sprawled across 12,000 acres of prime cattle country. Nathan ran 300 head of Hereford cattle, employed 2 permanent ranch hands, and brought in seasonal help during branding and roundup. By any measure, he'd built something substantial in the 15 years since arriving in Wyoming territory with his wife Catherine and infant son. But Catherine had been gone for 4 years now, taken by a fever that started mild and turned deadly within a week. Nathan hadn't figured out how to live in the spaces she used to fill. His son, Ethan, found him standing motionless in the yard, staring at nothing. "Fences mended on the north pasture," Ethan reported. "Found 2 posts rotted through. Replaced them both." Nathan nodded, his silence speaking volumes. At 23, Ethan had essentially been running the ranch for the past 2 years, while his father went through the motions of living without quite managing to live. The young man possessed his father's skill with cattle and horses, but he burned with an energy Nathan had lost somewhere along grief's dark road. When someone you love is drowning in sorrow, how far would you go to save them? "There's a letter social at the church next week," Ethan said carefully. Reverend Thompson mentioned it in town. Folks write letters, put them in a box, and people draw them out to correspond with each other, supposed to bring the community together. Nathan finally turned to look at his son. "I'm not writing letters to strangers. Might be good for you." "No." The silence stretched between them, familiar and heavy. Ethan had stopped trying to pull his father from grief's grip months ago, but every so often, he still made an attempt, more from habit than hope. That same evening, 7 miles away in a small bedroom at the back of Hayes Inn, Isabella sat at her desk with a sheet of paper and a desperate plan. She'd watched her mother shrink into loneliness for 3 years. She'd seen the way Margaret's hands trembled when she thought no one was looking. She'd heard her mother crying quietly behind closed doors on nights when the wind howled and the house felt too big and too empty. The letter social at church seemed like providence. Isabella would write letters on her mother's behalf, sign Margaret's name, and perhaps spark something that might grow into the connection her mother refused to seek herself. She knew it was deception. She knew her mother would be furious if she discovered it. But fury seemed preferable to the slow death of isolation. "Dear friend," Isabella wrote in her careful script, "I am a widow of 3 years managing an inn and small ranch in Silver Creek. I write seeking thoughtful correspondence with someone who values honesty, hard work, and perhaps a bit of companionship in this often lonely territory. Sometimes love requires courage, sometimes it requires deception, sometimes it requires both." Across the valley, Ethan sat at his own desk, forming letters in a style slightly different from his natural hand. If his father wouldn't reach out for connection, then Ethan would reach out for him. "Dear friend," he began, "I am writing in hopes of finding correspondence with someone who understands the challenges and satisfactions of frontier life." Neither young person knew that their separate schemes would soon collide in ways that would shake 2 families, scandalize a town, and prove that the quietest hearts indeed write the loudest letters. The letter social at Silver Creek Methodist Church drew 47 people on a warm Saturday evening in late August. Reverend Josiah Thompson, an earnest man of 60 with thinning hair and thick spectacles, had organized the event to foster Christian fellowship and perhaps spark a few courtships in a community where women remained scarce. The rules were simple. Write a letter introducing yourself, seal it with your name on the outside, and place it in the box. Throughout the evening, people would draw letters and begin correspondence with their matches. Isabella arrived with her mother, both dressed in their Sunday best. What Isabella didn't reveal was that she'd already submitted 3 letters on her mother's behalf earlier that week, slipping them into the box when the church stood empty. Across the room, Ethan stood with his ranch hands, wondering if his own secret letters had made it into the box. He'd recruited his foreman to submit them during a supply run 2 days ago, paying the man an extra $1 for discretion. When Reverend Thompson called Mrs. Margaret Hayes, Margaret startled, looking at Isabella with confusion. "I didn't submit anything." "Maybe someone submitted one for you?" Isabella said innocently, her heart hammering. "You should go draw." Margaret moved forward with as much dignity as she could muster. She reached into the box and withdrew 3 letters, glancing at the names: Martha Willoughby, Cyrus Thompson, and Nathan Blackwood. Several more names were called before Ethan heard Mr. Nathan Blackwood. His stomach dropped. He hadn't anticipated his father's name being called when Nathan hadn't attended. The crowd stirred with whispers. "Mr. Blackwood isn't present," Reverend Thompson said. "Is his son here?" Ethan raised his hand reluctantly. "I can take them to him." He reached into the box and pulled 3 letters, one from an elderly widow, one from a neighboring rancher, and one from Margaret Hayes. Recognition struck him immediately. Hayes's inn sat just 7 miles from their ranch. Could this be the answer? A woman who understood loss, who managed property and livestock, who might see past his father's rough exterior to the good man underneath? Have you ever taken a risk that terrified and thrilled you in equal measure? That's where transformation begins. The letters flew back and forth twice a week for the next month. Each response deepened the connection, each missive growing warmer and more revealing. Ethan learned about the challenges of running an inn, the weight of a widow's grief, the fierce love for a daughter who deserved more than frontier hardship. Isabella learned about cattle ranching, the guilt of a father who felt he'd failed his son, the slow suffocation of unprocessed loss. They wrote as their parents but revealed themselves in the words. Through the deception, something genuine began to grow, not between Margaret and Nathan, who remained unaware of the correspondence, but between Ethan and Isabella, who were falling in love with each other's minds while pretending to be someone else. By the 3rd week of September, Ethan had begun signing his letters, "Yours, Nathan," and Isabella had begun signing hers affectionately Margaret. Neither could have predicted what would happen when the two families finally met face to face. The Silver Creek Harvest Supper took place on the last Saturday of September in the church fellowship hall. Every family in the area contributed food, and the long tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, vegetable dishes, fresh bread, pies, and cakes. Neither Margaret nor Isabella knew that Nathan Blackwood and his son had actually decided to attend this year, Ethan having finally convinced his father that complete isolation served no one. During the blessing, Ethan found himself scanning the room, and his eyes landed on a young woman with chestnut hair and a determined expression. She stood beside an older woman who carried herself with rigid dignity. When the prayer ended, Ethan made his way toward them, curious. As he drew closer, he heard the older woman say, "Isabella, stop fussing with the pies." The name clicked into place with sudden, shocking recognition. This was Margaret Hayes' daughter, which meant the woman beside her was Margaret herself, the woman his father had supposedly been corresponding with for the past month. His stomach dropped. Before he could retreat, Isabella turned and their eyes met. For a single suspended moment, understanding passed between them. Her face paled, then flushed crimson. She knew. Somehow, she knew. The truth has a way of revealing itself at the most inconvenient moments. But sometimes, inconvenience is exactly what we need. "Ethan, come meet Mrs. Hayes," called Clara Patterson, who had appeared at his elbow. "This is Margaret Hayes and her daughter Isabella." "Mrs. Hayes, this is Ethan Blackwood, Nathan Blackwood's son." Margaret extended her hand politely. "Mr. Blackwood." "Mrs. Hayes," Ethan managed, shaking her hand while his mind raced. Isabella said nothing, staring at him with a mixture of horror and fascination. "Is your father here?" Margaret asked. Before Ethan could answer, Nathan appeared behind him. "Father, this is Mrs. Hayes and her daughter Isabella. Ladies, my father, Nathan Blackwood." Nathan nodded stiffly. "Mrs. Hayes?" Margaret studied him with sharp eyes. "Mr. Blackwood, I understand you run cattle." "I do. Must keep you busy." "It does." The conversation died there, neither adult willing or able to push it further. An awkward silence stretched until Clara Patterson announced loudly, "Well, isn't this nice? I heard you two were corresponding through the letter social. Folks in town have been talking about it." The temperature in their small circle dropped 20 degrees. Margaret went rigid. "I beg your pardon?" Clara barreled on, delighted with her gossip. "The letters, Nathan and Margaret, writing back and forth. Everyone thinks it's just lovely. Two widowed people finding companionship." Margaret turned to Nathan, her face now pale with fury. "Is this true?" Nathan looked utterly bewildered. "I have no idea what she's talking about." "You haven't been writing me letters?" "I've written no letters to anyone." Margaret's gaze swung to Isabella, who looked like she wished the floor would open and swallow her. "Isabella? Mama, I can explain. Did you write letters using my name?" The fellowship hall had grown quieter, nearby conversations dying as people sensed drama unfolding. Isabella's voice dropped to a desperate whisper. "I only wanted to help. You were so lonely, and I thought..." "You thought you could deceive me? Make a fool of me in front of the entire town?" Nathan turned to Ethan, understanding dawning on his weathered face. "Son?" Ethan swallowed hard. "Pa, I can explain too. You wrote letters pretending to be me? You wouldn't reach out to anyone, and I thought maybe..." "You had no right." Nathan's voice, rarely raised, cut through the room like a whip. Conversations stopped entirely. Everyone stared. Margaret grabbed Isabella's arm. "We're leaving." "Mrs. Hayes, wait." Ethan started. "Your family has done quite enough, Mr. Blackwood. I suggest you stay away from mine." She marched toward the door, dragging Isabella with her. The room erupted in whispers as they left. Nathan stood frozen, humiliation and anger warring on his face. Then he too turned and strode out, leaving Ethan standing alone in the center of the fellowship hall with dozens of eyes on him and shame burning in his chest. When everything falls apart, that's when we discover what we're truly made of. Will you run, or will you fight for what matters? Outside, Margaret practically threw Isabella into their wagon. "How could you do this to me?" "Mama, please. Do you have any idea how humiliating that was? The entire town has been gossiping about letters I didn't even know existed." Tears streamed down Isabella's face. "I just wanted you to be happy again." You're so lonely, and I thought if you could connect with someone. That was not your decision to make. Margaret's voice cracked. I am your mother, not your project. My life is my own business. They rode home in bitter silence. When they reached the inn, Margaret went straight to her room and shut the door. Isabella sat in the kitchen, crying quietly into her hands, until she heard a knock at the back door an hour later. She opened it to find Ethan standing there, his hat in his hands and misery written across his features. I'm sorry, he said immediately. I came to apologize to both of you. She won't see you. She won't even look at me right now. I understand, but I needed you to know that I'm sorry. I thought I was helping my father, but I only made everything worse. Isabella stepped onto the back porch, closing the door behind her. The September night had turned cool, and she wrapped her arms around herself. I did the same thing. I thought I could fix her loneliness with a few letters. Did you write them all? Ethan asked. Everyone. Did you? Everyone. Ethan laughed bitterly. So we've been writing to each other this whole time, pretending to be our parents. They stood there in the darkness, and something shifted between them. Your letters were beautiful, Isabella said softly. Yours made me think maybe loneliness didn't have to be permanent. We made a terrible mess. The worst mess possible. Ethan smiled slightly. But I can't regret it entirely, because now I know you're real. Isabella felt her breath catch. I should hate you. You helped humiliate my mother. I should hate myself. I betrayed my father's trust. But you don't hate me? No, I find I very much don't hate you at all. The air between them crackled with sudden tension. Isabella knew she should go inside, shut the door, protect what remained of her dignity. Instead, she stepped closer. This is a terrible idea, she whispered. The worst, Ethan agreed, and then he was kissing her. Sometimes the heart knows what the mind refuses to accept. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is trust that knowing. What followed was a journey of reconciliation, honesty, and unexpected grace. Through barn fires that tested their courage, honest conversations that healed old wounds, and the slow rebuilding of trust, two families found their way to each other. 6 months later, a double wedding took place at Silver Creek Methodist Church. Isabella married Ethan, and in a quieter ceremony that followed, Margaret married Nathan. The entire town turned out to celebrate, and even Clara Patterson dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. The families merged their operations. The Blackwood Ranch focusing on cattle, while Hayes Inn continued serving travelers. It was unconventional, but then nothing about their courtship had been conventional. Years passed in the rhythm of frontier life. Children were born, businesses thrived, and the houses that had felt too empty now overflowed with life and noise and love. On warm evenings, the four adults would sit on the inn's porch, watching stars emerge, and marvel at how wonderfully foolish they'd been. You know what I think? Isabella said one such evening. We should write the story down. The whole ridiculous mess, the letters, the scandal, all of it. Future generations should know how wonderfully foolish we were. Future generations will think we lost our minds, Nathan pointed out. Probably, Margaret agreed. But they'll also see that sometimes losing your mind is exactly what needs to happen. I was so busy being sensible and strong that I forgot how to be happy. Same here, Nathan admitted quietly. Grief makes you stupid in specific ways. So does meddling, Ethan added. So does love, Isabella finished. They raised their glasses and toasted to foolishness, to second chances, to children who cared enough to interfere, and to frontier life that demanded everything but sometimes gave back more than you dreamed possible. The letters remained tucked away in a drawer. Testaments to love found in unlikely places, to second chances earned through honest effort, and to the truth that sometimes the straightest path to happiness requires the most crooked journey. Years later, when their children asked how their parents met, the adults would exchange knowing glances before launching into the story of the letter social, the deception, the scandal, and the love that grew from chaos. So you lied to each other? The children would ask, scandalized and delighted. We lied for each other, Isabella would correct. Big difference. And it worked? They'd wonder. Eventually, Nathan would explain simply, the story of the Blackwood Hayes Union became local legend, told and retold at church socials and harvest suppers. The families let the myths grow, knowing the truth was strange enough without decoration. Your story is waiting to be written. What brave, foolish, beautiful thing will you do to claim the life you deserve? Sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the smallest lies. Sometimes healing requires deception before it demands honesty. And sometimes the quietest hearts write the loudest letters. What chapter of your life needs rewriting? What connection are you too afraid to pursue? What would happen if you took one brave step toward the life you truly want? The frontier taught us that survival requires both strength and flexibility. Perhaps love does too. Don't let fear write your story. Don't let loneliness become your legacy. Reach out, take the risk, write the letter, whatever form that takes in your life. Because the most profound connections often begin with the smallest acts of courage.